From the outside, the evening appeared unremarkable. Washington City was settling into spring. Gas lamps glowed softly along the streets. Carriages rolled past brick buildings. The Civil War had ended just days earlier, and for the first time in years, the capital felt hopeful. President Abraham Lincoln had survived 4 years of unprecedented national trauma. He had carried the weight of a divided country. He had overseen a conflict that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet those close to him noticed something different that week. He seemed lighter. Witnesses later recalled that Lincoln spoke openly about reconciliation. He talked about rebuilding rather than punishing. He spoke of binding wounds, not reopening them. From a psychological perspective, this moment matters. It was a turning point not just for a nation, but for a man who believed the worst was finally over. But history rarely turns quietly. Lincoln was 60 years old. Tall, thin, and instantly recognizable, he carried himself with a weary calm. Years of leadership had etched deep lines into his face. Friends described him as gentle, introspective, and quietly humorous. He told stories to ease tension. He listened more than he spoke. That night, he planned something simple, a visit to the theater, a comedy, a moment of rest. This detail often gets overlooked, but it matters deeply. Leaders under prolonged stress seek normalcy as a form of recovery. Psychologists refer to this as cognitive decompression. Lincoln was doing what millions do after hardship. He was trying to feel human again. He chose Ford's Theater. It was a popular venue, respectable, familiar. Plays were a cultural escape in 19th century America. Theater was where politics, humor, and social commentary mixed freely. Lincoln had attended performances there before. Nothing about the decision seemed unusual. And that is where the danger hid. From a security perspective, the absence of fear is often the greatest vulnerability. At that time, presidential protection was informal. There was no permanent security detail, no standardized threat assessment. The idea that someone would deliberately target a president in a public setting still felt unthinkable to many. Someone else, however, had been thinking about it for a long time. John Wilkes Booth was 26 years old. He was an actor, a celebrity by the standards of his time. He came from a famous theatrical family. His father, Junius Booth, was widely known for both talent and instability. Alcohol misuse and erratic behavior shaped the household. Children raised in chaotic environments often develop extreme coping mechanisms. Some seek control, others seek recognition. Booth appeared to seek both. He was charismatic, handsome, confident on stage. Audiences applauded him. Critics praised his dramatic intensity. Fame gave him a voice, and he used it freely. But his views hardened as the country fractured. Booth supported slavery. He believed deeply in the Confederate cause. He viewed Lincoln not as a political opponent, but as a symbol of destruction. This distinction is critical. Psychologists studying political violence note that ideological fixation often begins with dehumanization. Booth did not see Lincoln as a man. He saw him as an obstacle. At first, Booth imagined himself as a hero. He spoke openly about grand actions. He fantasized about changing history. Friends later recalled his escalating rhetoric. This pattern is common in radicalization. Public speech grows more extreme before behavior follows. Initially, Booth planned an abduction. He recruited associates. He sketched ideas. He rehearsed scenarios. None of them worked. Plans failed. Opportunities vanished. Frustration grew, and frustration is a dangerous accelerant. When individuals invest their identity into a single cause, setbacks can trigger escalation. Experts call this goal blockage aggression. The failure does not weaken belief, it intensifies it. Booth began to shift his thinking. What if disruption was not enough? What if elimination was necessary? This is where psychological collapse and ideological extremism intersect. The belief that violence is not only justified but required marks a critical threshold. Booth crossed it quietly long before anyone noticed. Meanwhile, Lincoln continued forward. On the afternoon of April 14, 1865, the president prepared for the evening. He discussed future plans. He spoke about healing the nation. Witnesses later noted his optimism. From a narrative standpoint, this contrast is essential. Hope and hatred were moving toward the same place. Ford's Theater filled as night approached. Actors prepared backstage. Costumes were adjusted. The audience laughed and talked as they found their seats. The play, Our American Cousin, was a light-hearted comedy. Nothing about it suggested tragedy. But this is often how history unfolds, not with warning sirens, but with applause. From a preventative psychology standpoint, this case teaches a critical lesson. Violence driven by ideology often hides in plain sight. The warning signs are rarely dramatic. They appear as words, grievances, and escalating certainty. Booth was not hiding in shadows. He was well known. He moved freely. He blended into the cultural fabric of the city. That familiarity lowered defenses, both social and institutional. As the curtain prepared to rise, no one in the theater understood the convergence taking place. A nation on the edge of renewal, a man on the edge of irreversible action. And this is where everything changed. The evening unfolded exactly as planned, at least on the surface. The audience laughed. Actors delivered their lines. The atmosphere inside Ford's theater was relaxed, almost celebratory. For a city emerging from years of conflict, moments like this mattered. President Lincoln arrived with his wife and 2 guests. They entered the presidential box shortly after the performance began. Applause followed, polite but restrained. Lincoln acknowledged it briefly, then settled into his seat. From a behavioral standpoint, nothing appeared unusual. No visible tension, no signs of distress. This is important to understand. Many historical tragedies are later remembered as inevitable. In real time, they rarely feel that way. Behind the scenes, however, the situation was very different. John Wilkes Booth knew the building well. As an actor, he had performed there many times. He understood its layout. He knew the corridors, the staircases, and the timing of the play. Familiarity provided him with confidence, and confidence reduces hesitation. This detail matters psychologically. Individuals preparing for violent action often seek environments where they feel in control. Booth was not entering an unknown space. He was returning to a stage he believed belonged to him. Earlier that day, Booth finalized his plan. He coordinated movements with his associates. Each person had a role. The goal was not only to disrupt leadership, but to create chaos across the government. This level of coordination reflects deliberate intent, not impulse. As the play progressed, Booth waited. Waiting is often the most revealing part of these cases. It requires sustained commitment. There is time to reconsider, time to withdraw. Booth did neither. This persistence aligns with what psychologists describe as cognitive rigidity. Once the decision is locked in, alternatives disappear. At a carefully chosen moment, Booth moved. He entered the passageway leading to the presidential box. There was no forced entry, no dramatic confrontation. Security was minimal. A single guard had left his post earlier in the evening. This absence would later reshape how leaders were protected. Inside the box, Lincoln was watching the performance. The moment chosen coincided with a loud laugh from the audience. Booth understood timing. He understood distraction. These are learned skills, sharpened by theatrical experience. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Booth approached from behind. He used a small firearm. The action was sudden. Clinical accounts later confirmed that Lincoln was immediately incapacitated. There was confusion before understanding. This sequence is common in unexpected violent events. Booth then moved toward escape. He climbed over the railing of the box and dropped onto the stage below. The fall was awkward. Witnesses later noted that he appeared injured. Even so, he remained mobile. This persistence reflects a singular focus on completion rather than self-preservation. As he crossed the stage, Booth shouted a Latin phrase, "Sic semper tyrannus!" The statement was not random. It reflected his ideological framing. He believed he was acting against tyranny, not committing a crime. This is a critical psychological point. Individuals who justify violence often adopt symbolic language. It reframes actions as moral necessity. In their minds, responsibility is transferred to the cause. Booth exited the theater and disappeared into the night. Inside, chaos took hold. Audience members were unsure what they had witnessed. Some believed it was part of the performance. Others sensed something was wrong but lacked context. This delay in recognition is common during real-world crises. Medical professionals were summoned quickly. Lincoln was examined and moved to a nearby boarding house across the street. Doctors worked through the night. They documented his condition carefully. Their efforts were methodical but limited by the medical knowledge of the era. Throughout the city, news began to spread. Rumors moved faster than facts. People gathered outside the boarding house. Officials attempted to control information. Fear and uncertainty rippled outward. From a societal perspective, this moment marked a collective psychological shock. The following morning, Lincoln lost his life. He passed away shortly after dawn. The announcement stunned the nation. Bells rang, businesses closed, crowds formed spontaneously. The emotional response was immediate and overwhelming. This was the first time an American president had died this way. There was no precedent, no script for national grief on this scale. Psychologists studying collective trauma later identified this moment as a rupture in public trust and perceived safety. Meanwhile, the search began. Authorities moved quickly to identify and capture those responsible. Witness statements were collected, descriptions circulated, Booth's identity emerged rapidly. His fame, once an asset, now worked against him. He fled the city with one associate. They traveled through rural Maryland and into Virginia. The journey was difficult. Booth's injury slowed him. The pressure mounted as patrols closed in. 12 days later, the pursuit ended. Booth was found hiding in a barn. Surrounded and confronted, he refused to surrender. During the standoff, he was shot. He died shortly afterward. The confrontation ended his role, but not the case. His associates were arrested soon after. They were questioned, tried, and convicted. Some received long prison sentences, others were executed. The legal process was swift, reflecting the gravity of the event. From an investigative standpoint, this case transformed American security. Presidential protection changed permanently. Threat assessment became formalized. The idea of invulnerability was replaced with vigilance, but beyond policy, the deeper lesson lies elsewhere. This case demonstrates how ideology, identity, and grievance can converge into irreversible action. It shows how warning signs can be visible, yet dismissed. And it reminds us that history often turns not on grand battles, but on quiet moments when prevention fails. What investigators would later realize is this: the act itself was only the final step. The path toward it had been forming for years, and understanding that path would become the focus of everything that followed. Investigators faced immediate pressure. The nation demanded answers. Officials needed clarity. This was not only a criminal case, it was a crisis of confidence. The investigation began with witnesses. Dozens of people had been inside Ford's theater, their accounts buried. Some remembered movement, others recalled shouting. A few described the man they saw on stage. Memory under stress is unreliable. Psychologists explain that during sudden danger, the brain prioritizes survival over detail. This meant investigators had to corroborate every statement carefully. One detail stood out quickly. Several witnesses recognized Booth. His fame made him identifiable. Actors, stagehands, and patrons confirmed his presence. This drastically narrowed the search. Unlike many cases, the primary individual was known within hours. That recognition shifted the investigation's focus. Authorities began reconstructing Booth's movements. They traced where he had been seen earlier that day. They questioned acquaintances. They reviewed correspondence. What emerged was not a lone impulse, but a structured network. Booth had not acted alone. Investigators uncovered evidence of coordination, meetings, messages, promises of action. Each discovery reinforced the conclusion that this was a conspiracy, not a spontaneous event. From a psychological standpoint, group reinforcement matters. When individuals surround themselves with like-minded supporters, beliefs harden, doubt is minimized, responsibility becomes shared. This dynamic lowers internal barriers to extreme behavior. The trail extended beyond Washington City. Booth's escape route became a priority. Officials analyzed ferry crossings, rural roads, and known sympathizer locations. His injury limited his options. Medical treatment left traces. Each stop increased exposure. Meanwhile, the nation mourned. Public grief created intense emotional pressure on investigators. Every delay felt personal. Every unanswered question deepened anxiety. Leaders understood that restoring order required both justice and explanation. As the manhunt continued, Booth's mindset became clearer. Documents and testimonies revealed his ideological fixation. He spoke of destiny. He framed himself as an agent of history. This language aligns with what psychologists call moral absolutism. In this state, actions are no longer evaluated by consequences, only by perceived righteousness. Booth's refusal to surrender later reflected this rigidity. When he was finally located, the standoff was brief. Surrounded in a barn, Booth rejected negotiation. He did not attempt explanation or defense. He clung to his narrative until the end. Investigators then turned fully to the conspirators. Arrests followed quickly. Each associate was questioned separately. Inconsistencies emerged. Some minimized their involvement. Others deflected responsibility. This pattern is common when group-based actions collapse. Under scrutiny, the structure of the plan became clear. Booth had positioned himself as the leader. He claimed authority. He assigned roles. This hierarchy matters. Research shows that extremist plots often rely on a central figure who validates action and suppresses doubt. Without Booth, the group unraveled. The trial that followed was highly publicized. Proceedings were conducted under military authority. Evidence was presented methodically. Testimonies outlined the scope of involvement. The verdicts reflected both individual actions and collective responsibility. From a legal perspective, this case set precedents. It clarified how conspiracies against national leaders would be prosecuted. It also raised enduring questions about civil liberties during national emergencies. Beyond the courtroom, the impact was profound. Presidential security underwent permanent change. Protection became structured. Threats were assessed. Public access was re-evaluated. The assumption of safety was replaced with layered defense. But the most enduring legacy was psychological. This case forced the nation to confront a difficult truth. Violence does not always come from outsiders. Sometimes it comes from within cultural institutions. Booth was not hidden. He was celebrated. That familiarity blinded many. Experts later emphasized this point. Radical beliefs often coexist with social success. Warning signs are dismissed because the individual appears functional, articulate, and admired. This investigation became a teaching case. It demonstrated how ideology can override empathy, how grievance can masquerade as moral duty, and how unchecked certainty can escalate into irreversible action. As investigators closed the case, one question remained. Why did this happen at that moment? Why after the war had ended? Why during a moment of hope? The answer required looking beyond actions, into motivation. And that understanding would shape how the story was ultimately told. With the facts established, attention shifted to understanding why this happened. Not just how, but why. This distinction matters. History records events. Psychology explains them. John Wilkes Booth did not act in a vacuum. His behavior reflected a convergence of personal identity, ideology, and perceived loss. Experts examining similar cases describe this as grievance-driven radicalization. Booth experienced the Civil War as a personal defeat. The Confederacy's collapse challenged his worldview. More importantly, it threatened his sense of meaning. When belief systems fail, some individuals seek restoration through extreme action. From a psychological perspective, this is known as identity foreclosure. When a person defines themselves entirely through a cause, the loss of that cause can feel existential. Violence becomes a way to reassert significance. Booth framed his actions as historical necessity. He did not describe them as wrongdoing. He described them as destiny. This framing allowed him to bypass moral restraint. Responsibility was transferred to an abstract ideal. This pattern is well documented. Researchers studying political violence consistently find the same elements: rigid thinking, moral absolutism, dehumanization of opponents, a belief that violence is not optional but required. Booth displayed all of them. Lincoln, by contrast, represented reconciliation. He spoke of unity. He emphasized healing. For someone anchored in grievance, this message can feel like erasure. Peace threatens those who rely on conflict for identity. This contrast deepened Booth's fixation. After Booth's death, the legal process continued. His associates stood trial. Evidence was presented carefully. Testimony established roles and intentions. Sentences reflected both participation and degree of involvement. Some were imprisoned for life. Others were executed. The outcome sent a clear message. Actions against democratic leadership would be met with decisive response. For the nation, however, justice did not equal closure. Lincoln's passing reshaped the country's emotional landscape. Public mourning lasted weeks. Black crepe hung from buildings. Memorial services filled churches. The loss felt deeply personal to millions. This response illustrates collective trauma. When a symbolic leader is lost suddenly, communities experience shock, grief, and disorientation. Trust and stability is shaken, yet Lincoln's legacy endured. His vision influenced Reconstruction policy. His speeches continued to guide civic values. His leadership became a benchmark for future presidents. In this sense, the attempt to erase his impact failed. From an educational standpoint, this case offers enduring lessons. First, ideology can radicalize individuals who appear functional and successful. Fame, talent, and social acceptance do not protect against extremism. Second, warning signs often emerge long before violence. Escalating rhetoric, obsession with grievance, moral certainty. These patterns deserve attention, not dismissal. Third, security systems must adapt to human behavior. Protection cannot rely on assumptions of goodwill. It must account for ideological risk. Finally, this case underscores the importance of understanding motivation. Preventing violence requires more than barriers. It requires recognizing psychological pathways that lead to harm. Today, Lincoln is remembered not for how he died, but for how he lived. His commitment to unity continues to shape national identity. The tragedy that ended his life also transformed how the nation protects its leaders. History cannot be undone, but it can be understood. And understanding remains the most effective tool we have to prevent its darkest chapters from repeating.